next contribution is Peter J Kearney from UCC, and while we're waiting to get that set up.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks to Shane and Carol for the invitation. Health and crisis. The crisis that I want to talk about is childhood cancer and a social response to that, which I think has been extraordinarily healthy. I just want to situate myself, and I have to go back in time to the last century. And if you're tracing kind of the development of childhood cancer, you could start perhaps in the 50s. And what happened then in terms of treatment of cancer is that the first chemotherapy started to be produced in the 50s. And it produced a response, but the responses were temporary, and there was a lot of disillusionment after that. And in the 60s, when I was a medical student, childhood cancer was recognized as a death sentence, and the only question was really how you would support the child with cancer. In the 70s, I became a leukemia research fellow, and it was an extraordinarily exciting time, I suppose, because all of a sudden the survival of these children with an illness that was certainly fatal, they produced a 50% survival. And that's because chemotherapy, as used now, is used then, but childhood cancers are uniquely sensitive to chemotherapy, unlike, say, adult cancers. And this was really the first time that breakthrough research happened in medicine in pediatrics, because always up to then, research in children was regarded as a no-go area. So anyway, things just gradually improved. There was a lot of clinical trials and further improvement, and by the time of the turn of the 20th century into the 21st, the survival for childhood cancer and leukemia now is about 4 out of 5 children will survive. And as I kind of progressed through my medical practice, I'm retired now, but I kind of veered away from childhood cancer in the 80s and 90s, and for various reasons I returned to pediatric oncology in the year 2000. And that really was, for me, an extraordinarily enjoyable experience. If you think about life-threatening illnesses like childhood cancer, the famous medical dictum is prima non nocere, first do no harm. And what was extraordinary about treatment of childhood cancer was that you started with prima nocere, you actually did harm. The treatments we used were extremely harsh and very hard. And of course that demanded evaluation, and whilst the quality of life concept seemed appropriate, in practice it actually wasn't useful. Undoubtedly, the problems of success in pediatric oncology had unintended consequences, and these were quite clearly the ones that you could enumerate. They weren't immediately obvious, but I'd include social exclusion of sick children, extraordinary family disruption, unemployment, and sibling neglect. So there was a very high level of individual and family distress. So when I went back to leukemia and cancer in the year 2000, I was pretty long in the tooth, and so I was experienced, and yet I noted children coming back from Barretstown that seemed remarkably changed. And this to me just didn't make any sense at all. And the change was just visible to me, it was visible to the parents and the pediatric oncology nurses and the other health professionals. So that was the question I was faced with, what on earth was going on here. Now this is an aerial photo of Barretstown. Barretstown was from the camps that are associated with Barretstown, associated with home and walk-in camps. They were founded by Paul Newman. And children from Ireland started going to Connecticut, where the first camp was, and Newman said that there should be a camp in Europe. And for a lot of, after a lot of negotiation, the first camp in Europe was actually in Barretstown, County Clare, and the place was donated to Barretstown people by the government. And you can see it here in the area view. And just if I can get an arrow here going, these are the cottages where the children are in camp for 5 to 10 days. And up here is what's known as the med shed. It's a lovely name. It's a very good 24/7 medical facility, but it's a lovely kind of captures exactly what Barretstown does to their medical experience. It's a shed, and that's how they understand it. And then in these lovely grounds, they do all these kind of different activities, and they're closely supervised by really what are nearly always third level students, fantastically highly motivated kids who are specially trained. They're called CARs in Ireland, a much nicer name than the counsellor, which was used in the States. And they get through, and they get children from all over Europe, so it's an extraordinary achievement. 1,500 campers per annum for all over Europe. And it costs about €4 million per annum to run the camp, so it's no small feat. So I became intrigued. I made contact with Barretstown, and I became a volunteer pediatrician there, and that allowed, I suppose, participant observation. Over the years, I attended there on an annual basis. I interviewed all sorts of people there, gradually accumulating different people. I never interviewed the children, but I did interview the what I called alumni, and these were children who had been to Barretstown as children and as teens, and were now young adults. I was made invited to be a member of the Child Advisory Committee, and I went to visit American camps, and I was also a medical assessor for the association in their camps in France and the UK. So I gradually built up, accumulated over, I suppose, 7 or 8 years, or very slowly developing understanding of Barretstown. I think from a negative point of view, you can say what it wasn't. There was no clinical psychologist there, no child psychiatrist, no diets, no listening, there was nothing like that at all. And whilst orthodox medicine was downplayed, as beautifully exemplified by the term medshed, it was very tightly controlled by the excellent nurses there, and they made sure that their treatment was continued, but it was very much downplayed. Now the concepts that I gradually as conceptual tools to try and understand what's going on in Barretstown, I've used 3 theorists who may or may not be known to you: Victor Turner, René Girard, and Aaron Antonovsky. They're all more perhaps in the anthropological division rather than sociology. And I'll just deal with them in turn. Turner, his ideas of social drama, rite of passage, Mimosins and Girard, and Genesis and Antonovsky. Victor Turner, they were all born, interestingly enough, in the 20s. Victor Turner is a man, just when you read people, sometimes they're guys you'd love to meet, and I think I'd love to have met Victor Turner. But he did all his research in Africa, and living in with tribes there. And he first described social processes, and one that he described that was of interest to me was social drama, and the movement of, say, social order suddenly to social disorder. And so he described this process basically where you start with a sudden breach in routine social life, and followed, say, at that change, the mood switches from the ordinary, routine, indicative mood to a subjunctive mood of danger, excitement, and possibility. You get that sense of, you can sort of imagine it, if somebody suddenly comes in here and starts insulting somebody, you get a sudden change in people reacting to it. And that's followed by a crisis, which may or may not be, what can be potentially violent. Then the social response of regressive machinery, which may be, say, legal, but it may be a process, you can think of Northern Ireland, to mediate peace, and included in the digestive machinery would be a rite of passage. And the outcome then may be social harmony, or say in Northern Ireland, a peace wall, or say, of course, it can be resumption of hostilities and you can start all over again. But what intrigued me was, I think you can look at the social drama as a concept of what happens to a family when suddenly childhood cancer comes into their domain and their whole life is disrupted. But then sort of looking at, so you go from order to disorder, but looking at a rite of passage as a process of moving from disorder to order. This is first described by Ben Jennett, who recognized an anthropologist, published in 1909, but not published in English until 1960. And he described a three-stage model. And the first part of the model was separation. And the separation is sort of that is separation from society in general. And that kind of, so there's an exclusion, an isolation from what's going on in society. And then there's a transitional stage, and the transitional stage is characteristic by what's known as liminality. Liminality is the kind of a borderland experience. You know, when you're on the border, you're between, you're neither one or the other. And what happens, you can very clearly see it in Barretstown. These kids come in, they all have had experience of cancer treatment, and all of a sudden they just click, and they go into extraordinarily intense relationships that was certainly Victor Turner's description of communitas. Life isn't fast forward. And what then reaggregation is returning back into society then. And because you can envisage this is classically used for status change, and in, say, tribal Africa, where boys become men, they're isolated from the society. They go through this process and they're coming back into society as a man. Well, we see it nowadays as well in weddings. People go in and there's I noticed there's my daughter's a tendency to go away for a few days and come back then married. But, so there's status change. But status change for these children, it wasn't status change. They were clearly sick children before, and they were still sick children when they came back from Barretstown, even though they were transformed, but their home and their hospital said they're exactly the same. And what I noticed then from the various interviews with the cars and the children, that it felt that mimesis was a very important part of what was happening to them. And mimesis is the Greek word for imitation. And it's a special kind of imitation in that it's a subconscious imitation. And we see this all the time. If you look at fashion, if you look at the way things suddenly turn violent and you get a sudden escalation, if you think about it, it's all over the place. But it's subconscious. And René Girard was the great theorist of mimesis. He's been talking about this. He's a literary theorist since the 1970s, and he wouldn't be at all surprised that in the 1990s mirror neurons have been located in the frontal cortex of the brain. So he had this idea that in the cultural domain, we're very mimetic creatures. In the biological domain, it's largely genetic, but in the cultural domain, it's largely mimetic. And mimetic, we learn through mimesis very largely. But as well as that, he's been, and that wasn't really a new idea, people like David Tarr talking about that, but what he introduced the idea was that mimesis also drove desire. And unlike, this was kind of direct contradiction to Freud. Freud, desire wasn't an internal thing. We hankered for what was out there, what was dressed, the new beautiful dress, the new things that we hankered for something that was outside ourselves. So that was his idea of mimesis, and he was really interested in sort of what he called internal mimesis. Now so the mimesis can be described as a triangle, and sort of if you have the subject here, and he desires through a model. If I can get my arrow going again, maybe I can't do it again. So he desires an object through a model. And then the model can start, that thing can reverse, that you can get a violent spiral of violence and breed of violence, and in many ways world wars and all that kind of thing happens that way. Now, Girard also described what could be, so the thing about this kind of violence is that the subject and the model have to be in the same social space. You know, you won't get greedy about, you know, somebody in the last century. You won't get greedy actually about, you know, Walter Buffet, who's just got prostate cancer in America. You know, these things don't impinge us, but we can get very upset by somebody who's very, very close to us, and say somebody in the same department who gets an extra stripe or is promoted. But he also did describe then a kind of a triangular mimesis in a situation when the model is in another space. And this actually applies to Barretstown, because the Caras and the volunteers there, they're perceived by these seriously ill children as they're healthy, they're bountiful, they're generous to them, they look after them. They seem to be almost like angel guardians. And, so you have that kind of idea that they provide a mimetic role model. Now I want to sort of move on quickly because it took me an awful long time to get these bits together, but sort of understanding the rite of passage and how was it happening. It was happening through mimesis, and then the idea was sort of what was it that was changed, what was the outcome of Barretstown. And I found it very helpful this Antonovsky, who died, interestingly enough, in 1994 of leukemia, who invented the term salutogenesis. Now he was an American, but he spent most of his academic life as a medical sociologist, and spent most of his academic life in Israel. What he was interested in was really that his big interest was female survivors of the Holocaust. Now, these are people who have been through perhaps the most unspeakable kind of experiences that anybody could ever imagine. And yet he found that a very significant minority, up to a third of them, had a good life, that they were integrated into society, they were productive, and they had a great sense of joy and being. So he just said this doesn't fit anything that he knew about, you know, in terms of his career as a medical sociologist. And his conclusion was that disease and stress are everything. He could avoid it, you know, and much more importantly, he felt that the causes of health, which he calls salutogenesis, salute being a bit like the word like health, being a bit like slight, I suppose, and genesis generally is the origin of health. And there were more important than, say, the cause of disease, which is kind of what doctors deal with, pathogenesis. And he felt that the main components of salutogenesis were what he called, were essentially resources. He called generalized resistant resources, and this could be economic, education, and social class, and anything else they might be important. But an ability to use resources, and that produced a sense of coherence, which was basically a way of being able to understand the world, being able to manage the world, and make out the world as meaningful. So he rejected the health-illness dichotomy. And if you think about the pathogenic role which doctors practice, in the health services in general, is to dichotomize the doctor's note as to declare whether you're sick or healthy. But the salutogenic perspective sees health as a continuous variable, and it varies from health ease to disease, and even at death's door there's a modicum of health present. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but any of you here who are biologists would be very familiar with the term of homeostasis. I can just stick to this just for a little bit. The homeostasis is the sense of equilibrium in your health, and his idea of the salutogenesis, so that was an equilibrium. For instance, if your sodium is low, you must get it back up to what is recognized normal. Now, heterostasis was the basis of salutogenesis, and it described a social approach to health rather than a medical approach to health. And the idea of heterostasis, it's important, is that it's not trying to achieve an equilibrium, it's trying to achieve one's optimal potential. So you're trying to achieve maximal experience, total involvement. People that were exemplified like that might say rightly, rock climbers going up the north face of the Eiger, you know, crazy stuff. And Now, of course, it's not denying the importance of homeostasis, and heterostasis prefers the homeostatic base, and product is rather brief. I'll skip over these. Social disorders in childhood, the important one there is social exclusion. There's some very good studies now, long-term follow-up studies of lifestyle behaviour in adult survivors of childhood cancer. Very interesting stuff. Smoke less, drink less, substance abuse less. You think that's great, but also they are less risk behaviour, less marriage, less employment, education and power with peers. Very much that sort of a self-imposed social exclusion, weak sense of coherence. So that's what I'm suggesting. These are quotations from the survivor group interviews. I asked them to imagine life without the camp experience. And you can see they're very, very similar in America and the States. I've been very shy, keeping myself, etc. Life has been very different, etc. I won't kind of go through them, but you get that. So my conclusion is that Barretstown is where important social transformations happen. It works in a frame, a rite of passage. Practices mimesis of Anam Caras, which was the Irish word for soulmates, and the outcome can be pseudogenic with the dancing. That's interesting. Yeah, just to finish on this here, and it always amazes me about Barretstown, different things happen. But if you can see there's a labyrinth, and it's, you know, the labyrinth, that was just when I was, last year that I was up there, somebody introduced the labyrinth. But the labyrinth is about turning around. You know, and it's just a lovely way of encapsulating what Barretstown is. Okay, thank you.
Ask any questions, please.
You mentioned that you could see such a difference in the kids when you came back from Barretstown. Was there any work done, like, or did you notice while you were working there, did they improve their health outcomes? Or was it just that they were much happier in themselves?
Yeah, I mean, Paul was interested. There have been detailed, an excellent PhD done by a psychologist here in Dublin. It actually was, the approach was not, I don't think it works. It's kind of using things like self-esteem and all these sort of things, you know, looking for norms and how much they changed better than before and after. And whilst it was academically a terrific piece of work, it really didn't sort of get to grips at all that what was going on.
Peter, thank you very much. That was very interesting. And it's very nice to go back to, if you like, Victor Turner. It's a long time since I've looked at some of the very long time since I've looked at some of this. But it raises a lot of issues more in the practical domain. And I used to work voluntarily with the Corrymeela community in Ireland for a very long time. We used to take young children away, and I've actually witnessed similar things within the Corrymeela community. I think I know exactly what we're talking about. But there's one thing to witness that through something like participant observation, and there's another thing which you'll appreciate because your medical background is to kind of demonstrate some sort of causality or relationship. Because the first, essentially what we're talking about are we're talking in the abstract first of all, and these concepts by Turner and others. And they're also individualized in the sense that they deal with specific communities, i.e. tribal communities in Africa and other places. But the problem remains that you kind of have to validate this, unless if you're taking it out of the abstract into the kind of evidence-based world, which is where we're usually at in the kind of biomedical field. And I just think there has been for a very long time, I think it's changing now, but it's changing slowly, a reluctance to incorporate this type of information, this kind of observational work, into these schemas. If it's not evidence-based or you can't test it, if it's not testable, it becomes problematic. And I just wonder, in terms of things like quality of life, would you recommend any sort of format in terms of how this can be set up in such a way that it would be palpable to, or it would be acceptable to?
Well, I suppose there are two ways that I've kind of looked at it. One is actually when we went to visit particularly, say, the Camp America, which was in a beautiful French chateau. And, but there was a problem, you know, was looking at the criteria, say, at the rite of passage, you know, the degree of separation, you know, and you know, how excluded were they from their other lives so that they could sort of shed previous conventions and being labelled as a kind of a sick person. And what the French canon treated us a lot because it basically was different from Barretstown because it was like, say, a third-level hospital in a beautiful situation. And there was numerous medical, very, very difficult medical conditions being catered for, but the medical presence was terribly obvious. The nursing presence was very obvious. There had to be nursing supervision and medical supervision on the wards, and you just felt, now I can't prove, but you felt that the camp wasn't working as well. It hadn't the same intensity. What's quite extraordinary there, you go to Barretstown, day 1, the kids are all shy. Day 2, they're really starting to interact. Day 3, the place is humming, pumping. And now that didn't happen so much in France. So we felt that there was, you know, just looking at the criteria of a rite of passage, that separation wasn't popular. The medical thing was still hugely present. The separation is extraordinary. All their mobile phones were taken, everything. You know, modern teenagers without their mobile phones is kind of unreal, but it's a rule. And no TV, no internet, no newspapers, no nothing. You go in, you press a code, and you're in another world. And that's the way it is. So I think you can glean some evidence from comparing the degrees of how the rite of passage structure has been matched, and sort of just noting, I suppose, you know, the intensity of social interaction. The other thing that I did just very much a pilot study is Antonovsky has what he calls he has developed a questionnaire about sense of coherence, and it's a very interesting questionnaire. Now I got 4 children, not children, they were actually Caras, and asked them if they would partake in this. But they had been at the camp as campers, then they had gone away to 3rd level, and one was actually a medical student. So they had huge, deep knowledge of the camp, and I said, look, I want you to answer this questionnaire, and psychologists I'm sure tell I'm not doing it right, but I want you to answer it, envisage how your mindset was before Barretstown, how your mindset was after. And that's all I could do, but there were big differences. And these were very sophisticated people, highly trained, 3rd level kids, you know, who knew what they were doing. I was impressed by that. But it's something that, you know, I'm in touch with the American crowd, you know, hopefully everybody kind of take that questionnaire for it.
Anybody want a final question? Is everybody happy? Okay, thank you again, Peter. Thank you very much.